The wind came first, sweeping across the wide Wyoming plain like a warning whispered by the earth itself, rattling the loose shutters of Caleb Turner's ranch house and bending the tall prairie grass into silver waves beneath the pale autumn sun. Caleb stood on the wooden platform of the small train depot in Bitter Creek. Hat pulled low over his steady gray eyes, boots dusted with the labor of a long morning, and wondered for the 100th time whether he had done something foolish. The advertisement had been simple, honest, and perhaps a little desperate. Widowed rancher seeking a good woman to share work, home, and future. Most not fear hard winters or harder truths. He had not expected the ache in his chest as the train whistle pierced the air and the iron engine rolled into view, exhaling steam like a tired beast. He had not expected nerves. He had survived blizzards that buried fences, droughts that cracked the soul, and the kind of loneliness that crept into a man's bones at night. But waiting for a stranger who had agreed to cross half the country to marry him felt different. It felt like standing at the edge of a canyon and choosing to step forward without knowing how deep it went. Passengers began to descend in a shuffle of skirts, boots, and battered suitcases. Caleb's gaze moved carefully from face to face until it settled on a young woman standing near the carriage door, her gloved hand resting protectively on the arm of an elderly lady beside her. The younger woman wore a modest blue traveling dress, simple but neatly mended, her dark hair pinned back in a way that suggested practicality over vanity, her eyes, wide and searching, held both apprehension and resolve. The older woman, frail yet upright, leaned slightly on a wooden cane. Her silver hair braided and wrapped at the nape of her neck. A single trunk and two smaller ones sat at their feet. They looked nothing like the painted society brides Caleb had once glimpsed in town. There was no lace parasol. No exaggerated flourish. There was dignity and worry. The young woman spotted him first, as though she had memorized the careful script of his letters and translated it into the shape of the man before her. She took a steadying breath and guided her mother down the steps. Caleb stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he asked, his voice deeper than he intended. She nodded. "And this," she said gently, "is my mother Margaret Whitmore." The older woman inclined her head, her gaze sharp, despite the lines of age. Caleb felt a flicker of surprise he did not entirely hide. His advertisement had mentioned nothing about additional family. His letters had not asked whether she would come alone. He had assumed that was his mistake. For a heartbeat, the platform seemed to still around them. The murmurs of other passengers fading beneath the weight of unspoken questions. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her mother's arm as though bracing for rejection. "I wrote you," she began carefully, "and I would not leave my mother behind. She has no one else. If this is an inconvenience, I understand if you wish to reconsider." Her words were steady, but Caleb could hear the thin thread of fear beneath them. He looked at the elderly woman, at the slight tremor in her hand, at the quiet pride in her posture. He thought of the empty rooms in his house, rooms that echoed at night with memories of a wife lost to fever 3 winters past. He thought of the table that had once held 3 chairs and now held only one. "My home," he said slowly, meeting Eleanor's eyes. "Has room for both?" The relief that washed across her face was not loud or dramatic. It was softer, like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "That is kind of you, Amy Returner," she said. "Kindness," Caleb replied, "isn't in short supply out here. We just don't always speak of it." The wagon ride back to the ranch stretched long across the rolling land. The sky arched endless and blue above them. Auks circling lazily on distant thermals. Eleanor sat beside Caleb on the front bench. Her mother settled carefully behind them with blankets tucked around her knees. At first, conversation came in careful fragments, questions about the journey, the weather, the state of the cattle. Eleanor's voice was educated, precise, yet warmed by curiosity. She spoke of growing up in Ohio, of her father's passing, of debts that had quietly swallowed their home. She had answered Caleb's advertisement not out of whimsy, but necessity. "I can sew, cook, and keep accounts," she said. "And I am not afraid of work." Caleb believed her. There was strength in the way she held herself, even when the wagon jolted over rough ground. As the ranch house came into view, a sturdy 2-story structure of weathered wood, flanked by a red barn and a windmill creaking in the breeze, Eleanor's expression shifted to something unreadable. It was not disappointment. It was calculation, as though she were measuring her new life in boards and beams. Caleb helped Margaret down first, steadying her with unexpected gentleness. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine and dust, but it was clean. Caleb had spent days preparing, scrubbing floors, airing linens, repairing hinges. He showed them the front room with its stone fireplace, the kitchen with its iron stove. The small bedroom on the ground floor he had arranged for Margaret so she would not need to climb stairs. Eleanor paused in the doorway, eyes shining. "You thought of that?" she murmured. Caleb shrugged lightly. "Same sensible." That evening, as twilight painted the prairie in shades of rose and indigo, they shared their first meal together. It was simple fare stew, fresh bread, and coffee. But the silence that had once weighed heavy on Caleb felt different now. It was not emptiness. It was newness. Margaret spoke of herbs she could grow come spring, of remedies learned from her own mother. Eleanor asked about the ranch hands, about market days in town, about the rhythm of calving season. Caleb answered honestly, neither embellishing nor softening the hardships. "This land demands much," he said. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "So does life," she replied. Later, when the lamps were dimmed and the house settled into the soft creaks of night, Caleb stood alone on the porch, staring out at the starlit fields. He had expected awkwardness, perhaps regret. Instead, he felt something fragile and unfamiliar taking root. A sense that the house no longer stood as a monument to what he had lost, but as a promise of what might yet grow. Inside, Eleanor sat beside her mother's bed, listening to her steady breathing, wondering whether she had made the bravest choice of her life, or the most reckless. The prairie wind whispered against the walls, neither blessing nor condemning, simply bearing witness. Neither of them could know that the town of Bitter Creek had already begun to murmur about the mail-order bride who arrived with baggage heavier than a single trunk. They could not foresee the trials that would test the fragile trust forming beneath that roof. But on that first night, beneath a sky scattered with 1,000 unblinking stars, 3 souls slept in the same house, each carrying their own history, each uncertain of the future, yet bound together by a single decision spoken plainly on a dusty depot platform. "My home has room for both." Morning arrived with a sharp frost that silvered the prairie grass and painted the ranch in pale light, as though the land itself were holding its breath to see whether the promise spoken at the depot would endure beyond polite words. Eleanor rose before dawn, quietly dressing in her simple work dress and braiding her hair with efficient hands, determined that she would not be seen as a burden in the house that had welcomed her. She moved through the kitchen carefully at first, uncertain of where Caleb kept his supplies, but instinct and observation guided her. By the time he stepped inside from the barn, the scent of fresh biscuits and strong coffee filled the air. Caleb paused at the threshold, surprised by the warmth greeting him, and for the first time in years, the sight of a lamp glowing in the early hours felt less like memory and more like possibility. Margaret, though slow in her movements, insisted on sitting at the table with her mending basket, nimble fingers repairing worn shirts with a precision that spoke of decades spent keeping a household afloat through leaner times than most men could imagine. The days that followed were not wrapped in romance. They were stitched together with effort. Eleanor insisted on riding out with Caleb to see the cattle, learning quickly how to guide a horse across uneven ground and how to read the sky for signs of changing weather. Though her hands blistered and her muscles ached, she did not complain. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way she squared her shoulders when the wind pushed against her, the way she asked questions not to impress him but to understand. He began explaining the business side of the ranch, costs of feed, market prices, debts lingering from a harsh winter 2 years prior. To his quiet astonishment, Eleanor offered practical suggestions, calculating figures with swift mental arithmetic and proposing ways to stretch supplies until spring. For the first time since his wife's passing, Caleb felt less alone in decision-making, less burdened by the weight of uncertainty. Yet, Bitter Creek was not as generous as the open prairie. Word traveled quickly through town that the new bride had arrived with an elderly mother in tow. Whispers wound through the general store and drifted across the saloon floor. Some questioned Caleb's judgment. Others muttered that an aging woman would be nothing but extra expense. When Eleanor first accompanied Caleb into town for supplies, she felt the curious stares and heard the murmurs fade into strained silence as she passed. She kept her chin lifted, offering polite greetings that were met with mixed responses. Margaret, remaining at the ranch that day, sensed the tension upon their return. Kindness must sometimes be proven, she said softly, her eyes wise with experience. Let them see who you are, not who they imagine you to be. Opportunity to prove themselves came sooner than expected. A late-season storm rolled in without warning, fierce winds tearing across the plains and driving icy rain against the ranch house. One of Caleb's neighboring ranchers, a widower named Thomas Hale, was thrown from his horse while attempting to secure loose cattle near the creek. The men carried him to Caleb's home, as it was closest, fear etched across their faces. Margaret, despite her frailty, rose with quiet authority. She directed Eleanor to boil water and fetch clean cloths. Her hand steady as she examined the injured man. Years of tending to sickness had not left her. Beneath her gentle demeanor lay knowledge earned through hardship. Through the long night she guided Eleanor in setting a splint and easing the fever that threatened to take hold. Caleb watched from the doorway, humbled by the strength residing in the very woman some townsfolk had dismissed as useless. Thomas survived. By morning, gratitude replaced suspicion in the eyes of those who had carried him in. Word spread again through Bitter Creek, but this time it carried a different tone. The elderly mother was not a burden. She was a healer. The bride was not fragile. She was steadfast. The ranch that had once seemed too quiet now hummed with renewed respect. Even so, true acceptance would take more than one act of mercy. It would require time, paciencia, and the steady proof of character revealed through ordinary days. As winter tightened its grip, challenges pressed closer. Supplies dwindled faster than expected, and a portion of the cattle fell ill. Caleb wrestled with discouragement, the familiar shadow of loss creeping at the edges of his resolve. One evening, as snow gathered in drifts against the porch, he confessed his fears aloud for the first time. "I thought bringing you here meant I could offer safety." A admitted, voice rough. "But I cannot promise ease." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand warm against his calloused fingers. "You did not promise ease," she said. "You promised room, and room means space to endure, to grow, to face hardship together." Margaret nodded from her chair by the fire, the flames reflecting in her thoughtful eyes. "A house is built of wood," she added, "but a home is built of willingness." Those words settled into Caleb's heart like embers, glowing quietly, but persistently. It began to see that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it arrived quietly on a train, carrying a single trunk and a cane. He saw it in Eleanor's unwavering work ethic, in Margaret's calm guidance, in the way laughter slowly returned to rooms long accustomed to silence. The three of them developed rhythms, shared meals, evenings by the fire, discussions about planting plans for spring. Even the harshest winds seemed less threatening when faced together. By the time winter began to loosen its hold, Bitter Creek no longer whispered with doubt. Instead, neighbors stopped by with small offerings, jars of preserves, spare feed, invitations to church gatherings. Eleanor found herself teaching children their letters in the afternoons. Her education becoming a gift to the wider community. Margaret's remedies became sought after, her wisdom valued rather than questioned. Caleb, once known as the solitary widower, was now seen riding beside his wife with quiet pride. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the thawing fields, Caleb stood on the porch beside Eleanor and looked out at the land that had once felt too vast to bear alone. "I was afraid," he admitted softly, "that I might not have enough to give." Eleanor slipped her arm through his. "You gave what mattered," she replied. "You gave room." Behind them, Margaret's gentle humming drifted from the kitchen, a melody woven from memory. The Wild West love vibe.